York Police Department, otherwise known as the NYPD, is no stranger to controversy. They have a history of violent behavior, dating all the way back to the early 60s.
The only reason you're not in handcuffs going to jail and getting summonses in the precinct is because I have things to do. Okay. That's the only reason that's not happening. Because this isn't important enough for me. You're not important enough.
In 1962, they arrested a mobster named Frank Lino for the murder of 2 police detectives. Mr. Lino alleged that the officers stapled his hands with a staple gun and drove a broomstick into his rectum. In 1985, officers arrested Mark Davidson on charges of drug dealing. The officers interrogated him using a stun gun and threatened to attach it to his genitals, which caused him to falsely confess. In 1997, a police officer in Brooklyn used a broken broom handle to sodomize a man whom the police officer claimed sucker punched him. And it turns out the guy didn't actually punch the police officer.
You sit on a throne of lies.
NYPD police officers also sodomized Michael Mineo with a radio antenna and Ralph Johnson with a police baton. Even though they seem to enjoy a good rot up a guy's butthole, the NYPD has still yet to shy away from one of their classics, the chokehold. Last year, the NYPD got a lot of negative attention over the chokehold death of Eric Garner. Not only were they using a technique that was prohibited by the police department in 1993, but they waited 7 minutes before trying to resuscitate Mr. Garner. The NYPD does an excellent job in putting individuals in harm's way, but they also have their fair share of violence toward protesters. In the 70s, a coalition of activist groups accused the NYPD of finding ways to oppress lawful dissent. A judge sided with the coalition and set in several restrictions against the NYPD, keeping them from interfering with public and lawful protests. Despite these rulings, law enforcement officials have been able to both weaken and violate these restrictions to carry out surveillance over the Occupy Wall Street movement, the 2004 Republican National Convention protesters, members of the Muslim community, and the Black Lives Matter movement. During the 2011 Occupy Wall Street movement, the NYPD arrested over a whopping 700 peaceful protesters walking across the Brooklyn Bridge. Some even claimed that the police led them onto the bridge in an effort to trick them into being arrested for standing in the roadway. Last year, the NYPD used pepper spray and long-range acoustic devices to blast loud noises at protesters who were protesting against several of the police killings that had happened earlier that year. There are several cases against NYPD officers committing their own crimes. In 1992, 6 NYPD officers were arrested for trafficking drugs from Brooklyn, New York onto Long Island. It was alleged that the officers knew about, but were not arresting drug dealers in exchange for cash and even guarding the buildings where the drug dealers lived. Some officers were even suspected of buying and selling crack.
You owe me $15,000. I'll take 25% of the dope uncut. He sprouted antlers like a gazelle, like an elk. He landed again, he ran. He scored a touchdown.
Earlier this year, officers in Staten Island were given quotas and even awarded points for every misdemeanor and felony arrest the officers made. If they didn't meet these quotas, they faced the possibility of being transferred out of their unit. And finally, the NYPD has been editing its own Wikipedia pages. Several news organizations reported that 50 out of the 15,000 IP addresses associated with edits to the NYPD wiki page were made by the NYPD themselves. So I'm going to count all 50 of those computers that made changes as sins.